Welcome back to the Rhetoric Central YouTube channel. I gotta get used to saying a different name than what I'm used to saying. Welcome to Rhetoric Central. So today we're going to be reading a piece by Jürgen Habermas, everyone's favorite Jürgen. And if you're in my class, which is the most likely reason you're looking at this video, you'll have read the other Habermas piece as well. So these two pieces go together. The one other Habermas piece, and the thing that Habermas is probably most famous for, and he's famous for a lot of stuff. He's been around for a long time. I was kind of surprised. I was like, oh, is he dead? He's like, no, gosh, he's still alive. 2022, he's still around. So he published this book at the end of the 60s called The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. This is dissertation, or sort of. The German system's a little different. It was this big work that he did, and he did it as a book. And it was translated into English in 1989. And this made him not necessarily a household name, but a name that many academics knew, which was about the public sphere being a historical category as well as an important political category at the same time. So historically, in the 18th century, and I'm giving you a really fast and dirty version of something that people have criticized him for doing at an entire length of a book, of not going into enough depth on. So obviously this is a reductive account. In the 18th century in Europe, to certain parts of Europe, certain countries of Europe, there was an opening with discourse at coffee houses and salons and Tischgesellschaften, these various societies where people would meet and discuss things. They would discuss things like literary matters, but they would also discuss, potentially, questions of politics, questions of the state. And all of that discourse together begins this thing called the public sphere. We think of the public as something that's always existed. The public doesn't always exist, because the public is constituted by people's speech, by coming to public opinion, being able to form an opinion on the basis of rationality applied to the concerns of the day, not abstract rationality used for philosophy or mathematics. Rationality about current events, about stuff that's going on in our collective life. This is the public sphere. This didn't always exist in some cases because you wouldn't be allowed to do this. You wouldn't be allowed to go around and publicly opine about how you think the state would be better run. That would be really offensive. You could be prosecuted under some of the laws, lèse majesté laws. Something like this still exists in, say, a country like Thailand. If you insult the king in Thailand, you can be prosecuted for this. So the scope of what you could talk about was greatly expanded in the 18th century. Okay, that's the quick and dirty version. But then in the 20th century, 19th and 20th centuries, radio and television and broadcast made it so that the state and other large powers in society organized what the public was themselves by saying, this is the thing that everyone's going to look at. It's going to come right into your home. It's amazing to think that people were like shocked by Elvis's hips on the Ed Sullivan Show. Maybe you know this story about early television. People were really scandalized by the way that Elvis danced and moved. But this medium was so much hotter, in the words of Marshall McLuhan. Is it hotter or colder? I forget which one it is. He uses them in a little unintuitive way. But I'm going to say it's so much hotter in the sense that, you feel that these images are kind of like right there with you. There's not a space of interpretation that's very clearly opened up, as when you read something and you're kind of imagining, whether it's a play or whether it's a pamphlet about politics, you have to kind of imagine a lot of stuff. You have to be a lot more active than when watching television. So part of the shock was that this guy was moving in a way that they hadn't seen a lot of people move. A lot of white families hadn't seen people move. So that was part of it, but it was also the sense of like, wow, events can happen in my home. So the public is now something that you read about, and then you go and have conversations about. It's coming right to you. You're being told on the nightly news what the public opinion is. You're being told what the important issues are of the day. So there's still newspapers. People are kind of reading alongside it. And now we're in a third phase. Again, I'm skipping over huge, very important things. But now we're in a third phase of social media, in which it's kind of hard to say exactly what's going on with social media in terms of the public. But are we even in the public when we're on social media? Some of you who are kind of in my class might be doing these media diet diaries, and we're looking at stuff. And one of the questions I'm asking you is, where's the public there? So if you're looking at a lot of like get ready with me videos, there's a huge following. There's a lot of people watching this. The question is that audience, that following, a public in the same way? Are they imagining questions of general concern? So there's literally real people watching this, but does that mean that it's a public? So this brings us to one of the questions that Habermas is like, people were criticizing the hell out of his stuff. And in some ways, that's why it's an important argument, because a lot of people were like, it's important enough that we have to critique it. We have to make it better. So that's kind of how academia works. Things become important when people are like, wait a minute, this is wrong in some way. If it's wrong in a way that's very obvious, people ignore it. It just dies. But if it's wrong in an important way, people are like, oh. So this is Habermas kind of coming back and talking a little bit about some of the things that are different from his theory because of the modern era. So that's what we're going to learn about today. Intro over. Reflections and hypotheses on a further structural transformation of the political public sphere. That's the way to kind of double down, be like, it's a further structural transformation. I was right the first time. It's still happening. So I will read the abstract here. This article contains reflections on the further structural transformation of the public sphere, building on the author's widely discussed social historical study, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, which originally appeared in German in 1962. That's even earlier than I thought. I think I said the end of the 60s. English translation 1989. The first three sections contain preliminary theoretical reflections on the relationship between normative and empirical theory. We'll talk about what that means when we get to it. The deliberative understanding of democracy. What other understanding is there? Well, we'll talk about that too. And the demanding preconditions of the stability of democratic societies under conditions of capitalism. And you might be like, why is capitalism being mentioned? We'll talk about that too. The fourth section turns to the implications of digitalization for Americans. I know we're struggling here that this isn't a Z, but people can spell things differently. It's okay. For the account of the role of the media in the public sphere developed in the original work, being this one, the Transformation of the Public Sphere, specifically to how it is leading to the expansion and fragmentation of the public sphere, and it is turning all participants into potential authors. That might not be how you feel when you log on. You don't even log on anymore. When you open the app on your phone and you look at what the internet is, you don't feel like an author. But if you do type, if you post, even if it's a picture, aren't you kind of the author? Don't you have certain rights that you're entitled to the content that you post sometimes? Is it your intellectual property? So this question of authorship is very important for him. And he's going to be a little bit whiny about it. But we'll talk about that when we get to it too. The following section presents empirical data from German studies, which show that the rapid expansion of digital media is leading to a marked diminution of the role of the classical print media. And classical here doesn't mean like dun 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 dun. It doesn't mean like classical music. It just means the period at which print media was dominant. So that's a lot of time. But he's really imagining sort of like the 20th century classical print media. We sometimes might call it here the kind of traditional or mainstream media. Sort of. The article concludes with observations on the threats that these developments pose for the traditional role of the public sphere in discursive opinion and will formation in democracies. Okay. As the author of a book published nearly 6 decades ago, and chosen by the editors of this special issue as the starting point for the current discussion, I would like to make 2 remarks. Judging by sales, don't mind if I do, the book, although it was my first, has remained my most successful to date. The second remark concerns the reason, I suspect, for this unusual reception. The book contains a social and conceptual history of the public sphere that has attracted a great deal of criticism, but has also provided new stimuli to more wide-ranging historical research. This historical aspect is not our topic. But for the social sciences, it had the effect of embedding the political concept of the public sphere in a wider socio-structural context. Socio-structural, what does that mean? Well, sometimes when people are looking at society, you might think about what's society made of? And you might be like, people. Society's made up of people. And this is kind of why Margaret Thatcher famously said there is no society. It's just a bunch of individuals, which maybe gives you the key to understanding why sociologists, when they look at society, they do not just see people. They don't just see human beings. They see structures. They see institutions, practices, norms, environments, ecologies, all sorts of stuff. But structures would be kind of the institutional account. Or a structuralist account. We don't need to go into all of it. That you would look at sociology. So things like television stations or the law would be part of society. And you couldn't account for the law just by accounting for individual lawyers and judges. That's not going to do it. You got to have a structural account. Okay. Until then, the term had been used in a rather unspecific sense, primarily within the conceptual field of public opinion that, since Lazarsfeld, had been conceived in demoscopic terms, from the point of view of the demos, the people. What do we think? So Lazarsfeld is this guy that is doing this sort of kind of propaganda research on public opinion. Public opinion in the 20th century, after World War II especially, but during the wars, the period of the big wars, the world wars, in the early 20th century, people are like, well, what is public opinion now? It's not some kind of like very obvious thing that you can refer to as coming out of newspapers. It has something to do with these other effects, and they wanted to study it scientifically. So the public opinion poll, there's a whole history there, is developed at this time as a way of studying public opinion scientifically. What public opinion is, as opposed to something that would be in an earlier period, you'd be like public opinion, and then you would represent it discursively, sort of a kind of 18th century way of saying everybody knows, very casual kind of way of representing that, a place that people can contest a lot. Are there problems with public opinion polling? Absolutely, there's huge problems with public opinion polling, but it does contribute something to the story about what the public thinks. So that's what he's talking about there with Lazarsfeld. Okay, as a result, it would be studied with a view to its functional contribution to social integration, and in particular to the political integration of the citizens. Although I am well aware that the social significance of the public sphere goes far beyond its contribution to democratic will formation in constitutional states, I also discussed it subsequently from the point of view of political theory. In the present contribution, too, I take as my starting point the function of the public sphere in ensuring the sustainability of the democratic political community. Martin Zeliger's and Sebastian Sevignani's interesting reflections have persuaded me to reflect on the further structural transformation of the public sphere, But he's only looked at a little bit of it. Okay, so he's apologizing. I will begin by addressing the relationship between normative and empirical theory, and then he's going to do all this stuff. We already read this in the a version of this in the abstract, so I'm going to skip it. Within this theoretical framework for which the structural transformation provided a preliminary socio-historical analysis, I will outline how digitalization is transforming the structure of the media and the repercussions of this transformation for the political process. The technological advance of digitalized communication initially fosters trends towards the dissolution of boundaries, which seems good. Yay, go public sphere. All of the doors are open. Yay. But also towards the fragmentation of the public spheres. Oh no, all the doors are open. I can't find anybody. Why am I alone in this room? This platform character of the new media creates a space of communication alongside the editorial public sphere in which readers, listeners, and viewers can spontaneously assume the role of authors. The reach of the new media is shown by the findings of a longitudinal survey on the usage of the expanded media offerings. Whereas both television and radio have been more or less able to hold their ground in the course of the rapid increase in internet usage over the past 2 decades, consumption of printed newspapers and magazines has plummeted. The rise of the new media is taking place in the shadow of a commercial exploitation of the currently almost unregulated internet communication. And you're like, why is he talking about regulation? It seems to kind of come out of nowhere. Well, this has had a huge effect on how public discourse is shaped, is what you're allowed to say and do in different kinds of media. Some people are familiar with George Carlin's bit. I don't find it that funny, to be honest, but people still remember it as being very... I think George Carlin's kind of funny. But the 7 dirty words on television, and there he's kind of joking, he's making light of kind of censorship by the FCC of what you can say on television, and it's kind of inconsistent at different times. Well, it's inconsistent partly because it allows them to use their judgment. They wanted to be able to look at what's happening and then make determinations about that. And if you don't do that, then you have these kind of arbitrary or artificial rules, which become become easy to avoid. So when we're talking about the regulation of what you can say, sometimes it's things like curse words, but it's also about political speech. In the United States, we had something called the Fairness Doctrine. It was first called the Mayflower Doctrine, then became the Fairness Doctrine, that ruled over radio communication by the FCC. If you presented an opinion, you had to represent someone else who had the other opinion politically. Every time you would do it on the radio, you could imagine, if I'm a radio producer, how much that's going to affect how I think about radio programming. I'm going to avoid political discourse unless I already have a very strict setup where I can do this balancing thing. Otherwise, it's too chaotic and hard to do, on the fly. When that regulation stops being enforced under the Reagan administration, you see the rise of talk radio, where people will spend hours and hours and hours giving nothing but their political opinions. whether or not they are based on evidence. They don't not necessarily part of a debate. It becomes entertainment, political entertainment that people listen to all day long. If you're like from a home like mine, or from a neighborhood like mine, or even if you're not, you may have grown up around people who would, have radios and they would be working and stuff. They'd be listening to talk radio all day long, all day long. So that's a complete radical transformation, structural transformation of the public sphere in light of the law, that then also changes what kind of discourse we get. Radio discourse becomes political in the United States. On the one hand, this is threatening to undermine the economic basis of the traditional newspaper publishers and of journalists as the affected occupational group. On the other hand, a mode of semi-public, fragmented, and self-enclosed communication seems to be spreading among exclusive users of social media that is distorting their perception of the public sphere as such. So this is something that Habermas, he gets critiqued for this, and whatever, Habermas, you be you, bro. But he has this idea that there's like a correct perception of the public sphere. That there's certain things that are kind of justified or not. That's the normative versus empirical, which we're about to get into, what that means. So his normative stance here might kind of rub you the wrong way. He might sound like he's kind of judging you, and he sort of is. He's this old German guy, and he's telling you what he thinks. So, but sometimes the normative aspect of these isn't just someone's personal opinion. It's part of the way that they think critically about what they're studying. So this explains a little bit why Habermas is considered part of critical theory. He's from the Frankfurt School of social thought. That there was an institute in Frankfurt. There's a long story there. A lot of people that were associated with that had to flee the Nazis. Habermas is part of a kind of second or third generation, maybe really, of people, and they're coming back after the war to, in this case, West Germany, as opposed to East Germany. And Habermas's views is like he's very much in favor of democracy, which is what his kind of whole career has been largely about, thinking about this, the way that communication needs to exist for a modern democracy to exist. So from the point of view of American academics, who are the people who are reading him a lot, he may appear either to be kind of like a democratic theorist, a guy who's like kind of left-wing in the sense that he's very pro-democracy, very pro the people, but sometimes he's also seen as kind of right-wing because he believes sort of naively that if we had enough time of talking it out, that we would eventually get to rational consensus. And we don't do that because it's distorted by money and power, that there's some place we can get to where we didn't do it. Okay, so that's what's going on with Habermas. All right. In studies that deal with the role of the potential public sphere in constitutional democracies, we generally make a distinction between empirical investigations and normative theories. John Rawls, for example, speaks in this connection of ideal theory. I think that this alternative is oversimplified. In my view, the role of democratic theory is to reconstruct the rational content of the norms and practices that have acquired positive validity since the constitutional revolutions of the late 18th century, and as such have become part of historical reality. So one of the things that he's saying here is we have to look at norms themselves as the objects of our study. So there's a lot of different ways to think about what this would look like. And there's a kind of way that we all do this where there's certain things that you might grow up with that are traditions or manners or habits from the culture or the area that you grew up in. And you start wondering at some point, you're like, why do we do that? Someone tells you to take off your hat in the building. You're like, why, actually? You might have a sense as to how other people feel about that. You may even share that feeling, but you may realize that there's not clearly a reason that's articulated as to why you need to take your hat off. And someone will tell you a probably non-historical, mythological version of this, which is oh, well, knights used to have to do it or something. This is totally made up. That's not true. But that idea of kind of going back to well, how did the norm arrive? Or what was the meaning of it at some other moment? It makes us see the norm as being contingent, not as being absolute. So it could have gone differently. Our own norms in society could have been different. We could have had a society where you were only allowed to wear a hat inside, and of course that's true in different parts of the world. Habermas is thinking about doing that kind of criticism, a historical criticism of norms that are way more complicated, that are very hard to even pin down what they are about the way that democracies and constitutions work. Things about how we reason in public. So that's not a norm that's as clear as to specify. So part of the work is first just describing what that norm is. What does it mean to use one's reason in public. Like that's a whole philosophical thing you got to work out, but you also have to do it with historical material, all that kind of stuff. And then you interpret that, well, why did it develop that way? And therefore, what does it mean for us now? So that what it means for us now part is always there, even when you're doing historical criticism. Because you might decide to leave your hat on in the building and kind of stick it to the man, or you might take it off and defer. But it's going to feel different to you to make that decision with a historical awareness about where the norm comes from than if you had a non-historical awareness. You're like, that's just the way that it is done. There is no alternative, right? The very fact that the empirical studies of the formation of opinions under democratic conditions become pointless if they are not also interpreted in light of the normative requirements they're supposed to satisfy in constitutional democracies highlights an interesting circumstance. So if we figure out why people reason a certain way, but we don't have any idea about how reason ought to go, then who cares? It's just like we're just collecting stories. However, understanding this calls for a brief historical digression. For the revolutionary acts that endowed fundamental rights with positive validity first made citizens aware of the new normative gradient, which thereby became part of social reality itself. What did he mean by that? The historical novelty of this normativity of constitutional orders based on fundamental rights, whose unsaturated, like fat, it's better if it's unsaturated, character pointing beyond the status quo makes it peculiarly demanding, can be better understood against the backdrop of the usual form of social normativity. Social phenomena, be they actions, streams of communication, or artifacts, values or norms, habits or institutions, contracts or organizations, have a rule-governed character. This is shown by the possibility of deviant behavior. Rules can be followed or broken. There are different kinds of rules: logical, mathematical, and grammatical rules, game rules, and rules of action, where the latter comprise instrumental and social rules of action, which can be differentiated in turn according to strategic and normatively regulated interactions. So let's just stop there for a second. What's the difference between... So rules can be of different kinds. Not all rules are the same. Rules might be really hard and fast rules, or they might be kind of rules that have a lot of exceptions to them. And so it might be kind of mathematical, or it might be kind of like a habit. It could be anywhere in that range. And then also there are social rules of how we should act. And they are differentiated in terms of two different ways. Well, one way is I'm trying to beat you. I'm in a competition. We're playing basketball. What's going to be my strategy? So there's both the rules of basketball, and then there's the plays that we make. These are all kind of norms that we're creating for ourselves about how we strategize. Or understanding a kind of game like chess, I study the opening in order to figure out what the best strategy is. So I'm studying the rules not to follow them, but in order to use them. So that's one. Versus not just the strategic, but they themselves are normatively regulated, so that they are ethical or rules of justice. I don't play chess by the rules in order to be a just chess player. If I didn't play by the rules, people would be like, arbiter, come over, and he lost the game. He played the wrong piece. So you're just not doing it right. So these are different kinds of norms that society is made up of. It is the latter norms in particular, the normatively ones, the ethical ones, the ones about justice, that are distinguished by the peculiar mode of validity of the ought. As the nature of the sanctions for deviant behavior shows, such normative and behavioral expectations may make more or less strict demands, with morality imposing the most stringent demands. The universalistic moral conceptions that arose with the axial age worldviews are distinguished by the fact that they call for the equal treatment of all persons in principle. In the course of the European Enlightenment, this moral cognitive potential became detached from their respective religious or metaphysical background, and was differentiated in such a way that, according to the still authoritative Kantian conception, each individual in his or her inalienable individuality ought to be accorded equal respect and receive equal treatment. So one thing what's he saying kind of here, to give you a little bit of a sense, is this sense of kind of everyone having universal dignity on the basis of being human came up at a certain historical moment in time. People didn't always think this way. And there's some people that kind of don't want to keep thinking this way, They want to kind of think about what's best for their people. Yeah. That kind of a thing. But the sense that really what's ethical has to do with some kind of universality may originally come from religious ideas. One of them in Christianity is the idea of everyone being a child of God and having grace within them. In Judaism, there's a strong tradition that every life is its own universe in Rabbinic Judaism. So it needs to be kind of respected as an entire creation unto itself. All sorts of religious tradition. There probably is every religious tradition has, at this point today, some universalistic moral content. But when we today say we have to treat people equally, even if we ourselves may have a kind of religious background of faith that gives that some force to us, we know that what we mean isn't itself a religious statement. People don't have to hear that statement as religious. So that's what he's talking about. On this conception, each person's conduct must be judged in the light of his or her individual situation, in accordance with precisely those general norms that are equally good for everyone from the discursively examined point of view of all those possibly affected. A particular sociological implication of this development is especially interesting in the present context. We must recall the unprecedented radicalness of rational morality in order to gauge the demanding character of the oughtness claim raised by this egalitarian, individualistic universalism, and switching perspective from rational morality to the rational law inspired by this morality. To understand the historical import of how, since the first two constitutional revolutions that he's referring to are the American and the French. We should probably throw the Haitian in there, though, because it follows on very closely. So why only talk about the first two? The Haitian Revolution as well. Those first three revolutions, American, French, and Haitian, enact a new political order that's organized around a written document called a constitution. Now, some of you in the audience are going to say, well, what about the English Constitution and the Magna Carta and how that's been around for a long time? Okay, I hear you. But the revolution in England, there was a revolution in England, happened in the 17th century. They cut off the head of the king. They didn't create a constitution as an act after that document. Constitution is a kind of tradition that was invoked even during this revolution. So it's a little bit different there. It's not a single document. It's this weird kind of tradition that after these other revolutions formed itself to kind of maybe resemble those other, revolutionary constitutional orders more. Okay. What's the last sentence here? With the declaration of the basic rights and human rights, the substance of rational morality migrated into the medium of binding constitutional law, constructed out of subjective rights. Subjective rights, can you imagine? With those historically unprecedented founding acts that give rise to democratic constitutional orders in the late 18th century, the hitherto unknown tension of normative gradient. Somebody left some notes on this, which is great, but I am going to delete them. Oh, I'm not able to delete them for some reason right now. Oh well. Can I move them? Why won't it let me do that? Okay, whatever. I didn't think that was going to be on there. This encouragement to develop a new normative self-understanding went hand in hand with the new historical consciousness turned offensively toward the future, investigated by Reinhard Koselleck. Then as something, this amounted to a complex shift in consciousness that is embedded in the capitalist dynamics of a transformation of social conditions accelerated by technological progress. In the meantime, however, this dynamic had aroused in Western societies a more defensive mindset that instead feels overwhelmed by the growth in social complexity propelled by technology and the economy. You ever hear people talking about like things are just moving too fast these days? Things just change too fast. And you might be like, oh, those old fogies, but like, I don't know. Maybe I'm becoming one. It kind of feels like things are moving a little too fast. Things slow down. It's too much going on. It's hard to understand. And what a lot of people do is they just check out. But weirdly, what checking out means today is like looking actually at all of this content on your phone is like checking out. Be like, I'm just doing brain rot. This is what everyone refers to it as. Just doing brain rot. And it's like consuming all of this content that just happens not to be focused on the political or the social or the ecological. So that's interesting. Interesting way to think about it, if I may say so. But But the persisting social movements that continually reawaken the consciousness of the incomplete incursion of the oppressed, marginalized, and degraded, of afflicted, exploited, and disadvantaged groups, classes, subcultures, genders, races, nations, and continents, remind us of the steep gradient between the positive validity and the still unsaturated content of the human rights which have, in the meantime, been declared not only at the national level. So people say you have rights. Revolution, here you are. And we can celebrate those rights, and we can have holidays like July 4th and say, that's amazing. Look at all of our rights. We have achieved democracy. And there's something to that. That's kind of worth celebrating. But then you might remember Frederick Douglass's amazing speech. What to the slave is the 4th of July? And you're like, oh my God. I forgot that we kind of like didn't go all the way with what it would mean for us to fully embody human rights. And there's always going to be that distance. There's always going to be the possibility. And I don't say this to kind of dismiss the work and the claims of people who are working for justice, but actually just a feature of how I think democracy works is that justice can never be fully achieved. It's always in the future. Justice is always something kind of to come. And that's true of a theological understanding of justice, Judgment Day, kind of coming in the future. But it organizes the present. Same thing in a democracy. The justice has to be coming in the future. That's the way that we understand the present. So that goes back to that normative and descriptive distinction that not just for the critics, but for people in democracy is also blended. That we understand our times in normative terms, in part because justice, the idea of justice, the very concept of it, is important for public political discourse to understand itself, to be intelligible. If people are like, let's have a political conversation, and then they just started spouting facts about like imports and exports at each other, you'd be like, okay, sorry, what's the politics? You're like, I want to know what you think. We demand that people have a normative stance when they enter the political arena. We're like, if a politician, you're like, well, what's your stance on abortion? And they're like, I believe that it happens. But what's your normative stance? That's what we need to know. That's literally the information that's required for us to make a political decision. Yeah? Okay. Quite apart from these long-term processes through which basic rights are realized, what interests me is the normal case in which the status of free and equal citizens in a democratically constituted polity is associated with certain taken-for-granted idealizations. For when the citizens participate in their civic practices, they cannot avoid making the intuitive and counterfactual assumption that the civil rights they practice generally deliver on what they promise. Especially with a view to the stability of the political system, the normative core of the democratic constitution must be anchored in civic consciousness, that is, in the citizens' own implicit beliefs. It is not the philosophers, but the large majority of the citizens who must be intuitively convinced of their constitutional principles. On the other hand, citizens must also be able to trust that their votes count equally in democratic elections. Legislation and jurisdiction, the actions of government administration, are mostly above board, and that as general rule, there is a fair opportunity to revise dubious decisions. Even though these expectations are idealizations that the actual practice sometimes falls short of to a greater or lesser extent, they create social facts insofar as they are reflected in the citizens' judgments and conduct. He's saying something kind of weird here, almost Machiavellian. What Machiavelli is mostly known for, which is the one treatise that he wrote, The Prince, is organized around verita effettuale, the effectual truth. That what the tyrant needs to do is create their own reality by like just imposing a fact and makes it a fact for everybody else. That's what they need to do. One of the things they need to do. But they also need to respond to the reality that everyone else is actually acting upon, their sense of reality. The perception of reality is real because people act upon it. That's the idea. But he's saying the same thing here about democracy, not about tyranny. He's like, well, of course democracy is not always working. It's like always falling apart. It's like one of those cartoon cars that like you have to kind of constantly be putting the wheels back on as you drive it. Democracy is like a project of failure. But the way that it works is that we're partially deluded about it. That we're like, we act as if we could just always be just right about to put it together. And so we have to be able to kind of make these claims. If we don't have that discourse, we actually lose an essential component of that clown car that's always falling apart. Like that's the oil that makes the whole engine run, is this discourse of hopeful criticism. Trump's fatal exhortation would hardly have met with the intended furious response of the citizens who stormed the Capitol on 6 January 2021, He's German, so they don't say January 6th. That seems like the name of it to us, but he's just like 6th January. If the political elites had not for decades disappointed the legitimate, constitutionally guaranteed expectations of a significant portion of their citizens. So weirdly, he's saying here, he's like, you might be like, oh, democracy guy, he's going to be against January 6th. Well, he is against January 6th, I think. It's fair to say. But his diagnosis of it is that it's a symptom of something else failing. It's not like these people are evil or bad. People are coming out on January. I mean, who knows? I don't really know any of them. So, I mean, maybe I do know some of them, but we don't really know what they are morally as a person. Our normative evaluation of this event is not on the basis of whether these individuals are good or bad. That's that's too simplistic. Yeah. It's like, well, what does it mean? First of all, why is it happening? People are extremely distrustful of government. They're extremely distrustful of democracy. Don't really believe in democracy. So that means that something else has fallen apart earlier that they're responding to. Hence, a political theory tailored to this kind of constitutional state must be designed in such a way that it does justice both to the peculiar idealizing surplus of a morally based system of basic rights, which assures the citizens that they are involved in the exercise of democratically legitimized government, as well as to the social and institutional conditions which lend credibility to the idealizations that the citizens necessarily associate with their practices. A theory of democracy, therefore, does not need to undertake the task of designing, that is, constructing and justifying, the principles of a just political order on its own in order to instill them in the citizens like a teacher. In other words, it does not have to understand itself as normatively designed theory. Its task is to rationally reconstruct such principles from existing law and from the corresponding intuitive expectations and conceptions of legitimacy of the citizens. So this might even seem cynical if you understand it. He's like, we don't have a plan for how society should be. But now that we have one, now we need to rationalize it and try to justify it. And in some sense, when we can't, that shows us that we should probably do something else if we really can't rationalize it in any way. So it's sort of a weird position to take. But you might think about it, if you go back to like a very early society that doesn't have a lot of establishments, you can think about the show Deadwood. I like the show Deadwood a lot. It's a Western that's very closely based on U.S. history. But it's not really the U.S. because Deadwood begins when you're at the beginning of the series. You're not in the U.S., so there's not really any law. They have this guy who's like the sheriff, but basically you see he's like, he's the sheriff kind of because like he acts that way. Basically because people are like, I guess he is. And there's the very first scene in the show is there's this criminal that the people want to kill themselves. The mob wants to kill him. And then the sheriff ends up hanging him instead. But he has to what he wants to do is make this an act of the state. Make it something that seems legitimate. So the guy's dead either way. But it's different to be killed by a mob than to be killed by a sheriff. And to say that this is now an act of state, because now it does fall into the question of what justifies it. Because you can't really have that for something like random violence. Okay. It must either render the fundamental meaning of the historically established and proven, and hence sufficiently stable constitutional orders explicit, and explain the justifying reasons that can invest the de facto exercise of government with the actual legitimizing power in the eyes of their citizens, and therefore also ensure civic participation. That political theory, by making explicit the implicit consciousness of the mass of citizens who participate in political life, can in turn shape their normative self-understanding, is no more unusual than the role of academic contemporary historiography, which performatively influences the further course of the historical events it describes. That's a lot. This part is actually like a big run-up to the argument that I think is important for us to look at. I think it's still good to work through this part, but if some of this feels like a little bit too much, a little over your head, that's okay. This is really addressed to the academic debate that precedes all of the stuff about what's the role of this kind of theory that makes judgments within social science, within political science. So I'm going to skip to the next paragraph. Because the origins of the classical theories predate the constitutional revolutions of the 18th century, they could present themselves as a normative blueprints for establishing democratic institutions. So you have people like Montesquieu, you have people like Condillac, a lot of French philosophers who are writing, and sometimes they call them the Enlightenment philosophers, but who are writing political philosophy, and then there are people reading, be like, yeah, we should do that. Today, I feel like not a good idea. Don't just like take what a philosopher says and run with it. Society's too complex. It probably was too complex then too, but that was like how they were doing it. So that's what he's talking about, the classical theories, those kind of guys. However, a contemporary political theory can simply note that the exacting democratic constitutional idea introduces a tension between the positive validity of binding constitutional norms and the constitutional reality into the very reality of modern societies. And when extreme dissonances become apparent, this tension can still trigger the mobilizing dynamic of mass protests. Hence, such a theory must recognize that its task is reconstructive in nature. The Republican and liberal theoretical traditions, however, already distort this idea by one-sidedly according priority either to popular sovereignty or to the rule of law. The people, it's the laws, and thereby miss the point that the subjective freedoms exercised by individuals and intersubjectively exercised popular sovereignty are equally original. You got to have both. For the idea that underlies these two constitutional revolutions is the foundation of a self-determined association of free consociates. He doesn't say citizens here because this is kind of prior to an order which would make of your consociates your fellow residents, denizens, that it would make them citizens. Under law, whereby the latter, as democratic co-legislators, must ultimately grant themselves their freedom through the equal distribution of subjective rights in accordance with general laws. According to this idea of collective determination, which combines the egalitarian universalism of equal rights for all with the individualism of every subject, so all and every, that's kind of the liberal democratic ideal. It's for all and it's for everyone. So both you're belonging to the citizen body, the general public is part of what your duties are, part of what guides good political life. We have to give water to everyone. We have to have the mail go to a rural area, not just to where it would be, even though it's expensive to have mail go to rural Alaska. We're still going to do it because it's everyone's right to have mail. So all and every, we've got to have both. According to this idea of collective self-determination, which combines the egalitarian universalism of equal rights of all with the individualism of every subject, democracy and the rule of law are on a par. And only a discourse theory that revolves around the idea of deliberative politics can do justice to this idea. Okay, so that's section 1. Big theoretical run-up to why we should be able to read this article. Okay, 2. Zwei. The approach of deliberative politics can be traced back to the early liberal world of ideas of the Vormärz period. But in the meantime, it has unfolded in the context of the welfare state. Its chief merit is that it explains how, in pluralistic societies that lack a shared religion or worldview, political compromises can be reached against the background of an intuitive constitutional consensus. The secularization of state power gave rise to a gap in legitimation. Why you? Why do you get to be in charge, huh? You used to be able to be like, God, I have the mandate of heaven. Excuse me? Do you want to talk to Tian? You want to talk to heaven? That's why I rule. So if you're not going to do that, then you have to have some other kind of legitimizing. You could call it a myth. You could call it a reality. It doesn't matter. You have to have some process of legitimation. And he's saying secularization initially is a legitimation. There's a problem for legitimation. Religious conceptions of legitimacy were not replaced by a different idea, but instead by the procedure of democratic self-empowerment, which is institutionalized in the form of equally distributed subjective rights so that it can be exercised by free and equal citizens. At first glance, it seems quite mysterious how the legal institutionalization of a procedure of democratic will formation, in other words, sheer legality, could nevertheless give rise to the legitimacy of universally convincing results. Essential to explaining this is the analysis of the meaning that this procedure acquires from the perspective of the participants. It owes its persuasiveness to an improbable combination of two conditions. On the one hand, the procedure calls for the inclusion of all those affected by possible decisions as equal participants in the political decision-making process. Now, how do you get to participate in the political decision-making process? Today, you probably get to vote for a representative if you're of a certain age. So, make of that what you will. On the other hand, it makes democratic decisions in which all individuals together are involved, dependent on the more or less pronounced discursive character of the preceding deliberations. So the voting bit what Habermas is kind of pointing to is like, okay, well, we're making a decision, but what legitimates the decision is that we've had reasons given for the decision. We've had some kind of process of deliberation, which has made this. And pretty much every parliament in the world will still do this. The parliaments, which are supposed to represent the people, will come together to convene. In the United States, we have this kind of weird congressional, bipartisan, bicameral system, but it functions a little bit differently in a parliament, but same idea that this Congress, this parliament represents the people. And the parliaments will debate on the floor. Now, in most of the cases today, people are not voting, they're not changing their vote on the basis of the debate in the parliamentary floor. Now, I've met people who believe that that does happen. So I don't want to totally dismiss that, but I will say that I do not believe that that is what's happening. There may be some countries. This person that I'm thinking of, she was Dutch. And I imagine that at a certain period in the Netherlands, there's a different kind of political discourse that maybe did lead some people to be like, I really want to hear what the arguments are. But okay, even in places where clearly we're not changing our votes on the basis of what people from another party say in the parliament, why do we do this? Why do we have parliamentary discourse at all? You might say, I don't care. I don't ever watch it. I don't watch C-SPAN or Question Time with the Prime Minister on BBC. I'm not a nerd. Okay, but why do we feel like we need to have it, even if it's just a ritual? And it's the legitimizing ritual of the law. We're going to have some kind of deliberation where the arguments are heard so that when we vote, we're voting on the basis of a kind of ritual of reason. Yeah, except that we also have this other myth of like the parliament represents all of your reasoning. But votes are very different from reasons. Like I might vote for someone for a very different reason than I vote for someone else. I might vote for someone else and say, I'm voting for this person because I don't want that person. Not for any positive reason I would give this person. Right? This is a lot of American voting. Is like, I vote for the person to not have the other one. I don't really care who this person is. I just don't want the other person. Yeah. So if I were to give you a judgment, we might agree in a judgment but disagree with reasons. Or we actually have same reasons and disagree with the judgment. So if democracy only has the decisions, it doesn't really have a legitimizing principle. So we have to have something else that comes in and acts as deliberation. Habermas believes that real deliberation would give us real democracy. That's kind of where he's going. This assumption can be justified in turn by a falsifiable supposition that in the consultations preceding a majority decision, all relevant topics, requisite information, and suitable proposals for solutions are discussed as far as possible with arguments pro and con, right? He wants to have the full debate. Let's have it out. Let's have it. Let's do everything. And it is this requirement of free deliberation that explains the central role of the political public sphere. Incidentally, this abstract consideration is confirmed by the historical fact that something like a bourgeois public sphere emerged at the same time as liberal democracy, first in England and then in the United States, France, and other European countries. All of what we think about is like people talking about politics. You could take the point, and I think some people do take this kind of position. Who cares? You're not going to be able to change it with your words anyway. Now, I actually don't agree with that. I think that there are so many instances in history where, I mean, in a more basic way, I don't agree with it because, like, how could we ever know that the words didn't make a difference? You're very confident that they don't, but maybe that's the ideological position. To be like, well, all of these things that people always do, like have discourse and think about stuff. Going in politics doesn't matter because the politicians, they're all corrupt and crooked and they're going to do whatever they want to do anyway. Now, I don't necessarily also agree with Habermas that what we need to do is try to achieve this ideal of having the full public discourse and conversation have it as rational as possible. Because my point of view as a rhetorician is that there isn't a kind of discursive place that we can arrive at that will be free, even if we somehow got rid of money and power. I don't know how we would. That would be free of basic things about language and communication that are always there that are going to introduce something that maybe for Habermas would seem like irrational. It wouldn't be irrational to me, but for him it would be, which would be like we mean different things by the words that we're using. They call different things to mind. So someone like John Locke, who's a big kind of liberal theorist, this is a big problem for him, is that people, when they said words, didn't mean the same thing. And you could say that that's a big problem for democracy. It doesn't seem like an obvious problem for democracy, but if you went all the way down, you're like, we really want people to have arguments that justify the laws so that we can govern ourselves. Not having the same things in mind when we speak would be a big problem for that. Because I would say, I think immigration is a problem. And be like, I don't think immigration is a problem. But what we're imagining when we're talking about immigration is very different. Someone who is imagining immigration as a series of kind of violent acts is going to be different for someone who imagines immigration as like a bureaucratic process. People are going to have different emotions about it. So one thing we could do from a rhetorical point of view is that we would want to try to actually elaborate more of our imagination, of our meaning of words in order to have a better democratic society. So things like art and culture actually end up becoming really important for democracy, weirdly, because these are the things by which we derive meaning. And so when we see films and when we read great books and we have like a more complex imagination, our political arguments and our political speech also may become more nuanced and more flexible, more capable of dealing with a world in which other people don't see and think in the same way that we do. So this is kind of one of the ways that I differ from Habermas, but still share the conviction that like we probably need a lot more discourse in order to make democracy good. I just don't think that the good discourse is the one that's absolutely kind of sealed off from what he would think of as irrationality. However, those two requirements of the democratic process, namely deliberation and the inclusion of all citizens, can only be realized even approximately at the level of the institutions of the state, and especially in the representative bodies of parliamentary lawmaking. This explains the essential but limited contribution that political communication in the public sphere can make to the democratic process. Its contribution is essential because it represents the sole locus, which just means place, where public opinion and political will are formed in a manner that in principle includes in corpore, meaning like in the flesh, all adult citizens who are eligible to vote. And this can in turn motivate the decisions that citizens make collectively, but as individuals and in isolation of the voting booth. That is, of their own free will. These electoral decisions lead to an outcome that is binding on all citizens insofar as they determine the political composition of parliament. They determine it. So like, okay, we do need to talk a bit about, for the American audience here, we don't think about like we form parliament. We don't form Congress. Like we vote red or blue. Because we only have the two, it's harder for us to see, but what you would see in a parliament, let's say, had 4 or 5 parties that had different percentages, is a vision or an image of the population itself, kind of represented that way. I don't think that Americans tend to see it that way. You can look at our Congress in the same way, but that's what he means by we determine the parliament, is that it's a representation of the population and its political differences and alliances or whatever. On the other hand, the contribution of the public sphere to the formation of public opinion and political will in a democracy is limited because, as a general rule, no collectively binding individual decisions are taken there. So in the public sphere, all this important stuff happens, but nothing actually happens there. We can always continue the debate. We don't actually get to the point of decision. So you could just be like someone like right now, Elon Musk is all over the news because they're at the Treasury Department. And people are like, oh, they're going to control the payments system. And there's all this kind of politics back and forth about what that means, whether it's legal or not. But whether or not it's legal, the idea being like, we can just like stop this thing from being paid, so then it will go away. We're not going to have a public discussion about it. We're just going to do it. That's a little bit different than the public sphere, where we talk a lot about what can happen, but we're not going to like do anything here. It's going to stop the payments or turn them back on. That's kind of why people sometimes are cynical about argument and logic and public discourse when it comes to politics. So like all this talk, where's the action? But what Habermas is trying to say is that like you actually can't make these actions legitimate unless you have all of this talk. That otherwise we totally lose democracy. So democracy really requires all of this pointless talking. If we didn't have this, we couldn't have democracy. It wouldn't be possible. And that's his point of view. These public opinions, which are compiled out of topics, contributions, and information, and thus assume a distinctive profile, compete over the relevant issues, the correct policy goals, and the best problem-solving strategies. One such circumstance is especially relevant in our context. The overall influence that the will of the citizens, hence of the sovereign, acquires over the decisions of the political system, essentially on the enlightening quality of the contribution of the mass media to this formation of opinion. This is because opinion formation is sustained by the prior processing of topics and contributions, alternative proposals, information, and supporting and opposing positions by journalists. So if you only ever hear of one way of doing something, it's not going to be controversial. You're not even going to have a vote on it. If you only have two ways of doing it, you'll be like, oh, A or B. Once the third person comes in, they're like, well, what about this? So I think about this a lot with climate policy and the different kinds of climate policies people propose. I think a lot of times people have become very familiar with the idea of let's stop carbon emissions. But it's sort of a confused politics, not because, I agree, actually. I think it's a really severe problem. We really need to stop carbon emissions. But it's like, which ones? How? Like, who's responsible? What's not happening that's making it difficult to do that? There's kind of a confused sense around this because there's not actually that great of a public discourse about climate policy. Climate policy is always presented as urgent, but so urgent that we can't get into the specifics publicly. We just need to stop emitting carbon. And one of the weird effects that has is that it depoliticizes the issue. It kind of makes it a moral issue for people of saying, like, well, what can I do in my own personal life? The politics of the issue is like, who's going to pay? How are we going to do it? What's the timetable? We would have all these decision points, but we can't see those decision points unless we have political discourse that shows us the opposing areas where these decision points would form. Now, there might be other people who know those decision points who aren't part of the public, but then is it really a democracy if they're just going to decide on their own? They don't have any political pressure that they have to face. They just do whatever they want. Well, that doesn't feel very democratic. That's kind of the point that he's trying to make here. However, the result of the competition over opinions and decisions remains open within the public sphere itself. Here, deliberation is still separate from the decisions of the individual voters, because the electoral votes are only prepared in the public. It is only beyond the threshold of general elections that the elected members of parliament can consult and decide with each other in accordance with democratic procedures. So we do this kind of mass democracy thing, but then there's the democracy of the actual politicians, making alliances and trying to get the votes together, that kind of stuff. Only in the representative bodies with other state institutions, and in an especially formal way in the courts, are procedural rules tailored to the deliberative format of opinion and will formation that justifies the presumption that majority decisions are more or less rationally acceptable. This is another place where I just totally disagree with Habermas. Maybe because I don't have the faith that he has, that anybody in a political party is forming their opinion on the basis of parliamentary debate. It just seems weirdly naive to me, but in order to correctly assess the limited contribution that the political public can make, we must examine the organizational section of the constitutional text and the structural division of labor within the political system as a whole, and read it like a flowchart. It will then become apparent how the democratic flow of the citizens' opinion and will formation branches out beyond election and directed into the channels, besieged by the lobbying of the functional systems of party politics, legislation, jurisdiction, administration, and government. It ultimately flows into the decisions that stem, within the framework of the law, from compromises between functional imperatives, political and social interests, and voter preferences. The legitimate political results are in turn evaluated and criticized in the political public sphere and are processed into new voter preferences after the conclusion of legislative terms. There's an interesting one. I was talking to a good friend of mine today. He's Romanian. He lives now not there or here. And I visited him in Romania many years ago. Love to go back. Love Romania. Romania recently had an election. Presidential election. And they got to not to the runoff stage, but to the preliminary stage where you have two candidates. And then we go into a runoff. And one of the candidates, there was a lot of suspicion around him, around his candidacy. He seemed to be, Romania is part of the EU, one of the younger members of the EU, but part of the EU. And he was found out later to be heavily financed. His campaign was heavily financed by Russian state operators. So they canceled the election, or they annulled it. So they actually had legitimate results. And then the Romanian parliament, as far as I understand, voted to annul the election. They're just going to do it again. We also had in Venezuela, in the United States, there's a lot of questions about election integrity and things like that in very different directions. Complicated stuff, but it's weird to think that we're now at a stage where you can have legitimate results come in and then be like, we're not sure if they're legitimate. We're just going to do it again. We're not going to go through the whole process. So the election system itself is deeply compromised all over the world. Not necessarily because it's compromised necessarily because people are manipulating it, but it's compromised because people perceive that it's being manipulated. You can't have an election system if people don't believe in the results. Even if they're legitimate, it doesn't matter if people don't think that they are. This is back to the verita effettuale. Like, if people do not believe in election results, it doesn't matter how secure they are. So, fascinating stuff. The assumption that political discourse is also oriented to the goal of reaching an agreement is often misunderstood. It by no means implies the idealistic conception of the democratic process as something like a convivial university seminar where we all come to the same. And also, that is not how university seminars are, let me tell you. They can be heated. On the contrary, one can assume that the orientation of reasonable participants to the truth or correctness of their argued convictions adds even more fuel to the fire of political disputes and lends them a fundamentally agonal character. Why agonal? Well, he's picking up here on some of the criticisms that were made of him. And there was a period for a while, this is like decades ago now, but where people were talking about agonistic publics, going to ancient Greek, to wrestling, to the idea of the agon, to a struggle. We think about antagonism, but agonism itself, kind of that the struggle and the contest is beautiful, and it's important, and it's productive of democracy. So that we shouldn't imagine democracy as overcoming the struggle. The struggle is something which should be one of our values. There's a lot more to it than that. It had sometimes a kind of like feminist flavor of critique, which maybe surprise you. It might not sound a lot like some of the ways that feminism is talked about today. But feminism is a very rich, broad, and complex tradition of thought and practice. Okay, to argue is to contradict. Only in virtue of the right and even the encouragement to say no to each other can the epistemic potential of conflicting opinions unfold in discourse. For the latter is geared to self-correction of participants who, without mutual criticisms, could not learn from each other. So this is why I feel like I have to do this more often than I'd like, where I have to kind of just disagree with all of my students. Be like, what do you mean? I disagree. And for some reason, this is quite shocking to some people. Be like, how is teacher disagreeing with me? I'm like, well, it's your chance to defend yourself. And I'm not just doing it to play devil's advocate. I'm doing it because we need to learn how to do this. How do we defend our opinions? So I think arguing with people is something that a lot of people avoid. We shouldn't argue. It's bad. It's morally wrong. Is that a democratic morality? I feel like if our morality was democratic, we would be like, arguing is good. You should practice it and get good at it. So if we don't have that, I wonder what kind of morality we have. In the cacophony of conflicting opinions unleashed in the public sphere, only one thing is presupposed: the consensus on the shared constitutional principles that legitimizes all other disputes. Against this consensual backdrop, the whole democratic process consists of a tide of dissent that is stirred up over and over again by the citizens' search for rationally acceptable decisions oriented to the truth. Oriented to the truth seems a little bit weird. That might be a translation thing, but I don't think it is actually. I think what Habermas is pointing to there is kind of a pragmatic view of truth, where it's important that we kind of move towards the truth, even though we might be aware that we never get there. And that might be disturbing to you if you're someone like many people who believe we already are in possession of the truth, and the only thing that we need to do is hold on to it tightly, like Patrick Swayze in Dirty Dancer, where he just like wraps her up in his arms, and it's very romantic. That's how you're gonna hold on to truth. It's just like, oh, don't never let me go. But I think a lot of people who, because they take it really seriously, oftentimes they're really like, yeah, you're right, we need to get, and what we need to do is really figure out what the truth is. Philosophers who go into this question have realized again and again that, like, actually maybe truth isn't like that. Truth isn't something that is amenable to like being possessed. So what you can do is kind of move towards it, like an ideal point. You know those asymptotes? Like you're never going to reach the infinity. You're never going to reach truth, but you literally can get closer to it. So not all hope is lost. All right. The deliberative character of the formation of public opinion and political will by the... Oh, I should do a little shout out to my sponsor here. My sponsor is Kroger Seltzer. This is the bargain basement seltzer water. And this flavor is blackberry citrus. I don't think the citrus is coming across very much, but it is water that I'm paying for. The deliberative character of the formation of the public's opinion and political will by the voters is measured in the public sphere by the discursive quality of the contributions. Discursive just means, speechy, languagey. Not by the goal of consensus, which is in any case unattainable. Rather, here, the participant's orientation to the truth is supposed to ignite an open-ended conflict of opinions that gives rise to competing public opinions. The dynamic of enduring dissent in the public sphere likewise shapes the competition between parties and the antagonism between government and opposition, as well as differences of opinion among experts. Even the experts disagree. Actually, that's something that I like to remind people when they think about kind of science and they think about cutting-edge research, that what you get at the cutting edge of research is a bunch of controversy. And kind of hopefully, if you are a scientist and you're researching something and nobody else knows about it, you're kind of so specialized that nobody else knows about it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's unimportant. Maybe you're working on a protein structure that is really important, but it's so specialized that it's hard for you to communicate your research. Really what we want is a bunch of people looking at a kind of research project and having different points of views and arguing about it in order to kind of continue the research project. And people aren't going to all look at the same thing if it's very simple and you just kind of do it in one way. So weirdly, also science relies on controversy. Not just democracy, science, scientific progress, if you believe in that. Depends upon controversy. And that's what you discover when you look at science. Historically, you see all the controversies that it's had, but also at the cutting edge, you don't find a bunch of consensus. You find consensus right before the cutting edge, and then the cutting edge is the controversy. The latter is simple enough. It merely spells out the plain will of the citizens to obey only the laws they have given themselves. Without such a consensus on the meaning of each deliberative democratic self-legislation, the respective minorities would not have any reason to submit to majoritarian decisions, for the time being at least. In making this point, however, we must not lose sight of the main factor on which the fate of a democracy depends. Judged from this normative standpoint, the institutionalized formation of political will must also actually function on the whole in such a way that the voters' constitutional consensus is confirmed from time to time by experience. Let's throw them a bone with some reality. Let's make sure that democracy appears to keep being working. Like, it does sound like, kind of like he's an evil advisor or something, but he's totally oriented in the other direction. He's like, this is actually what we need to do in order to preserve democracy, is like, he imagined himself on the side of the people. Now, some people have, he wrote a book with the Pope, this guy Habermas, He's been around very powerful people for many decades because he was so famous for his democratic arguments. And especially in the kind of post-Nazi era in Germany, a lot of people were like, really, like, give me that democratic sheen. I really need to get some of that because either, maybe I was involved with the Nazis and I'm still in government. There's a program called denazification in the West German government, but it was never really completed. So there's a little bit of tension around that. That's a little different than exists here about our history. But there's also the way that, he just happens to be famous and he's been around a lot of... So you could see this as, now he's voicing the opinions of the elites. But giving him the benefit of the doubt for a second, and he's putting himself on the side of the people, it's like, we should get something some of the time. Like, even though we know we're all kind of like, we're just here talking like, hey, where's my check? Or like, where's my debt relief? Or why are my insurance premiums so high? Why are my eggs so expensive? Things shouldn't be like this. And if they keep going this way, you keep messing with me, it's going to go in a different way. But this is at odds with reality, one might object, even now in the oldest Anglo-Saxon democracies. Yeah, I have to say, I'm one of those people. The approval that the storming of the Capitol found among Trump voters probably also be reckoned as the emotive response of voters who for decades have lacked a sense that their ignored interests are taken seriously by the political system in concrete, discernible ways. The dynamic of political regression into which almost all Western democracies have been drawn since the turn of millennium can be measured by the decline, and in some countries also almost the demise, of this rationalizing power of public debates. On the other hand, this dependence of the problem-solving power of a democracy on the flow of deliberative politics highlights the central role of the political public sphere. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a digression on this already extremely overlong video. I'm not going to do the whole thing. It's just not going to happen. But I do want to go on a digression here about something about Habermas and how we might think about his project a little differently in light of something. So Habermas is really, he talked about these constitutional revolutions of the 18th century, the American and the French especially. One thing he doesn't talk about is as much the revolutionary part, the violence that's part of it. And I think a lot of people admire the revolutions for their violence, more so than for the Constitution. The Constitution is kind of like a symbol of a certain defiance. So in the United States, the Declaration of Independence, which is not really a legal document in the United States, the Declaration, I'm assigning it in one of my classes this term, it's still a remarkably powerful political document. And it was a document written before the kind of full-on confrontation between the British Empire and its colonies in the Americas at that time. So it's kind of a document inviting violence on the basis of this principle. So you could say partly what maybe Habermas is missing in some of his analysis and why it sometimes feels naive is a lot of the democratic rights and promises are premised on something that isn't just a substitute for the theological right of kings, that we kind of self-sovereigns appoint to ourselves a collective power by which we make the law in this Republican sense. It's also the violence with which that was won, and that's remembered. That's also true in the United States of the great rights that we won since the founding, the Civil War, the civil rights movement. We remember the kind of sacrifice and suffering of people. We remember it differently. Not everyone's on the same page about how to remember that. But we remember those moments of violence as a huge intrinsic part of the rights that we have. So when Habermas talks about rationality and the debates rationalize it, I think one of the things he's missing is that part of the justification, again, is about sacrifice. That you should vote, for instance, because people fought for your right to vote. They sacrificed. You owe it to your ancestors to vote. There's this idea that's very common. It's one of the most common ideas about why people should vote, which isn't you should vote because you're participating in this democratic deliberative process. What's the reason? So if you don't account for things that, again, he might think this is irrational, but things like sacrifice and violence, and how certain political imaginations sacralize violence, make it kind of justification for all sorts of other things, you're going to not be able to understand what's going on today. I think on January 6th, whatever you may think of what happened with the January 6th protesters, they were dressed, sometimes literally, but they dressed their speech in the language and the imagery of not just their speech, their actions. They dressed up as 1776. The Tea Party, this populist movement, was 1776 also. So this revolutionary imagination is still an important part of democracies today. And that's not for only one side of the political spectrum, even though both of those were conservative examples that I gave, or right-wing examples. Without a suitable context, however, the essential preconditions of deliberative politics for the democratic legitimization of government cannot gain traction among a population which, after all, authority is supposed to be derived. Government action, landmark decisions on the higher courts, parliamentary legislation, competition between political parties, and free political elections call for an active citizenry because the political public sphere is rooted in a civil society which, as the sounding board for the disruptions of major functional systems in need of repair, establishes the communicative connections between politics and its social environments. Moreover, civil society can only play the role of a kind of early warning system for policymakers if it brings forth the actors who organize public attention for the relevant issues that are preoccupying citizens. So people who are kind of thought leaders or opinion leaders. Today, a lot of the people who are opinion leaders are influencers. And the people who are thought leaders are kind of like self-help gurus. And I'm trying to say that without like a lot of judgment, but maybe that's part of my normative assessment of like, these are not whatever helpfulness that many of these people may bring to people's lives, they're really not part of a classical sense of what the public sphere is concerned with. It's very much focused on the self, on the individual. So this is a struggle for contemporary democratic theory of like, oh, what would it mean if discourse doesn't spontaneously seem to produce today? People who are kind of directing our attention to the things that would help us form our public opinions. If it's more about like entertainment or self-help or something like that, what do? Is there a democracy? As we shall see, the digitalization of public communication is blurring the perception of this boundary between the private and public spheres. Although the social structural prerequisites for this distinction, which has also far-reaching implications for the legal system, have not changed. From the perspective of the semi-private, semi-public communication spaces in which the users of social media are active today, the inclusive character of the public sphere, which was hitherto clearly separate from the private sphere, is disappearing. This represents, as I would now like to show, the disturbing phenomenon on the subjective side of the users of media, but at the same time draws attention to the inadequacy of the political regulation of those new media. Okay, so 3. This will be the last one that I do for today. I'm going to do the section 3. But so, he's an old man. He's like, I'm disturbed by what's going on online. I'm disturbed by social media. But he's not just disturbed because he's old. And even though I disagree with a lot of stuff, I think Habermas is always good to read on these kind of things because he organizes kind of a lot of the points that I think are important for us to think about, even if we come to different judgments. He's kind of doing some of that work at this abstract level that he feels like needs to be done in the public sphere. This is kind of the meta public sphere, like a discourse about how we're thinking and how we're feeling today. And this is always kind of part of the public sphere of like, how should we be having these conversations? Who should we be talking to? From way back in the 18th century when people were talking about this and a lot about etiquette and manners of political discourse and ways that you should dress and appear. But also like when we talk about civility and reasonableness, which should be the kind of professional or mature way. When people get triggered or all of these kinds of things that somehow disqualify their point of view because it's not expressed in the right way. We're also having this kind of discourse. So what Habermas is trying to do is raise that discourse, that meta discourse about the public sphere beyond questions of manners, beyond kind of like ticky-tacky stuff about fashions, and into these deep concerns about what the public sphere should really be talking about in the first place. So not thinking that at the level of whether individuals are doing it right or wrong. Okay. 3. Before addressing specific changes in the structure of the media and hypotheses concerning their implications for the political function of the public sphere, I would like to interpolate some remarks on the economic, social, and cultural boundary conditions that must be fulfilled to a sufficient extent as a precondition for deliberative politics. So he's beginning with a digression. Thanks a lot. For it is only against the backdrop of the complex causes of the crisis, tendencies of capitalist democracies in general, that we can assess the limited contribution of the digitalization of public communication may add to other relevant causes of an impairment of deliberative opinion and will formation. So he's like, okay, he's like, just take it as granted that deliberative opinion today and will formation, like what the public should be doing, not going so good. There is a problem. Something is on fire. He's like, but what we're going to talk about is what part social media basically plays into this and the internet. But it's not everything. He wants to assure you it's not everything. It's not just the internet. It's not just the phones. But it's part of it. Active citizenship requires, firstly, a largely liberal political culture. Liberal? Okay, let's just talk about this word for a second. In the U.S., in American political discourse, liberal means you got blue hair, you love cats, you are pro-LGBTQ+, maybe you watch the Grammys. Okay, I'm joking about these stereotypes of liberals as a political, not because I'm making fun of liberals. I'm making fun of these stereotypes. This is not a serious analysis of people's politics. But online, this is an effect that everyone is part of. Online, politics becomes a style. Like what people's political convictions are is like, what kind of lifestyle are you? You can see that that's actually part of that individualizing trend. Same thing with people who are like, I'm Giga Chad based, pro Elon, whatever. Like, people are making a lifestyle out of their politics all across the public sphere, the so-called digital public sphere, but also that they're understanding politics of other people in that same way. Very, very odd. This is not going to be useful for us to think about things in these terms. So this is not what liberal means here. Liberal here means, going back to the a Latin adjective for free. It's about freedom. It's about a order that's based on discursive sense of rights. It's kind of what he's been talking about before. The sense that we come to our political understanding through deliberation and through rationality. That's what liberal means in this context. Consisting of a delicate fabric of attitudes and taken for granted cultural assumptions. This is because the population's basic understanding of the democratic constitutional principles, which remains for the most part implicit, is embedded in an extensive network of historical memories and traditional beliefs, practices, and value orientations. These are preserved from generation to generation only thanks to customary patterns of political socialization and institutionalized patterns of political education. The time span of half a century required, for example, for the political resocialization of the population of the old Federal Republic of Germany after the end of the Nazi era, so that West German history I was talking about before, despite the preceding 150 years of constitutional development, is an indicator of the obstacles that generally have to be overcome by any acclimatization to a liberal political culture. Now, that example is probably not super vivid for you of like what West Germany was like in the 50s and 60s. Not for me either. So anyway, but that's what he's talking about. For the moral core of such a culture consists in the willingness of citizens to reciprocally recognize others as fellow citizens and democratic co-legislators endowed with equal rights. This begins with regarding political adversaries in a spirit open to compromise as opponents and no longer as enemies. Now, this is good. Someone made a note here, and I think they picked out a good sentence. See each other as opponents rather than enemies. That kind of goes back to that agonism thing, right? In agonism, I'm like wrestling against someone. I don't really have to like the person that I'm wrestling against. I don't have to dislike them either. It's like I respect them as an opponent. I want to defeat them, but I don't want to kill and murder them. You know, this isn't going to be war. There's a game element here to it. Now, some people are uncomfortable with that because, like, well, it's serious. Yeah, well, games are serious. Look how much of our culture is devoted to sports. Also, doesn't politics kind of feel like a sport? However, on the other hand, are we sure that there are never any enemies? So this kind of distinction between opponent and enemy, he wants to kind of make a structural thing, that like liberal political cultures structure it this way. But for me, this is a rhetorical division that can always be made complex, made more nuanced and more meaningful. And a lot of the things that I think would, or maybe one of the reasons that I don't totally share his view of like why a liberal political culture would be so great is that I think that sometimes it's effective to leave it ambiguous whether your relationship with someone is enemy or opponent. That there might be a kind of, in fact, even an ethics involved in not making that determination a bright line. In some sense, it might be kind of like, you're not my enemy. We're just kind of here for the struggle. You might be betraying a certain kind of weakness that you have of being incapable politically of making that distinction. So that's the view of Carl Schmitt, who I really hate, to be honest with you. But Carl Schmitt, he was a Nazi jurist, and he wrote a very powerful book called The Concept of the Political, tiny little book. And for him, the concept of the political was exclusively the distinction between friends and enemies. So I don't agree with either of these guys. But I think that the ability to recognize that that distinction is relevant to how people are making meaning in the political system, opponents versus enemies, friends versus allies, is important. Beyond the limits of different ethnic, linguistic, and religious ways of life, with reciprocal inclusion in a shared political culture of strangers who want to remain strangers to one another. Under conditions of cultural pluralism, this political culture must have differentiated itself from the relevant majority culture to such an extent that every citizen can recognize himself or herself as a member. So we actually don't want a political culture if we want this, if we want democracy like this. We don't want a political culture that just is our ethnic culture. That would be bad. That would be bad. It would mean that we would be extremely inflexible to any kind of need to change or rearrange the demos. So the demos, which is where we get that word democracy from, is the people. Well, there's a different word, the ethnos, which is the tribe. That's kind of where we get the sense of ethnic from. Now, ethnicities are always kind of made up. There's some anthropologists will study this called ethnogenesis. It's fascinating stuff. Accounts of how, because this still happens in the present moment, how people kind of invent ethnicity and the mythology and all sorts of reasons they do this on the small scale as well as the large scale. We usually think today on these really large scales because we live in this complex globalized economy. So you can see this happening at all these scales. We don't want to have a political culture that is incapable of change. Do we? So if, again, this goes back to the question of what is our morality or are our values that democratic? I think a lot of people want stability, want a sense of stability. But if we love democracy, we kind of have to be open to the fact that it needs to change. In order for democracy to be stable, it actually needs to be very flexible. It needs to be capable of changing a lot because it's going to change a lot. So that sense of democratic stability is going to be very different from a sense of kind of unification around a single identity. That's not going to work for democracy. The social bond of society, however heterogeneous, will remain intact only if political integration generally ensures a form of civic solidarity that, far from demanding unconditional altruism, I don't have to love everybody. I mean, maybe religiously you do, but not politically, calls for a limited reciprocal readiness to help. This kind of solidarity goes beyond the willingness to make compromises based on one's interest. Nevertheless, among fellow members of the same political community, it is only bound up with the expectation of reciprocity at some indeterminate time in the future, specifically with the expectation that others will feel obliged to provide similar assistance in a similar situation. So you think about insurance. Today, there's a lot of people that are like, Maha. This is not new, this kind of Maha movement. A lot of the ideas have been around for a long time. And I've had many conversations with people in my life who are very dedicated to their health. They put a lot of work in to their health, They go to the gym, they eat right, they're careful, they think about it. And so they recognize that the effort that they put in is a kind of sacrifice. And so that the health care that they get, they feel that they deserve. And so then they look at somebody else and that well, they don't really look at them. Well, I guess they do kind of look at them. Look at someone else and they say, well, that person's not taking care of themselves. They're not doing as much. So they don't deserve as much. So that's a different sense of reciprocity, right? You have to kind of sacrifice in order to get something. And that analogy from the economy into something like how we should distribute healthcare politically is really powerful for a lot of people. You could also look at it differently and saying, hey, anybody can fall on hard times. I'm not that concerned with whether someone's health is earned or not. I just want to make sure that when I am sick, and everybody that is in my society is sick, that they can go get help. So that's a different attitude of reciprocity, that we all are part of a society already, so we all deserve to get help for when we're sick. Not that we have to kind of do some individual sacrifice in order to earn it, right? There's a difference between a right and a wage, You have to earn something as a right you have. A second condition that is necessary for an active civil society is a level of social equality that allows the electorate to participate spontaneously and to a sufficient extent in the democratic process through which public opinions and political will are formed. Although such participation must not be compulsory. The architecture of the constitutional state system of fundamental rights, which guarantees on the one hand the freedoms of private citizens through subjective private rights, and on the other the political autonomy of citizens through rights of public communication and participation, only becomes fully accessible in light of the functional meaning of the complementary roles that private and public autonomy of citizens also play for each other, aside from their respective intrinsic value. So here Habermas sounds a lot like, weirdly, Hannah Arendt, where for her this distinction between the private and the public is absolutely essential for political life. that you need a kind of private realm. You need a home, or it doesn't have to. We're doing space. It doesn't have to be a space. You have some aspect of your life that is not directly kind of able to be politicized directly. You have to have some kind of sense of privacy. So that the public sphere can kind of be a place where people go out and kind of choose and make decisions about what they wish to appear there. What she calls this in the space of appearance, the public space of appearance. But here, this might kind of seem funny to you, especially if you're a young person. I feel like young people, one generational thing is that privacy is like so not valuable. And it's not really believed that privacy is a right. People kind of think that they're being spied on every day by their phones. They think that kind of like, people already have all sorts of access to things. So the sense of what privacy would be, how privacy would constitute what the public is harder to see today, because on the one, we also have like people's private lives are what the public sphere seems to be made of. If you go on social media, you see a lot of people's private lives, a day in the life. Spend this time with me, kind of watch what I am doing in my personal life. And the content doesn't like justify itself beyond that. So it's saying like what is private is the public. And of course there's a feminist take on this, which was the personal is political. The weird thing though, I think, is that when a lot of the stuff is put online, it's not being politicized at all. The justification to a mass audience has really very little to do with whether it would be of public or political interest. So when feminists said the personal is political in the 60s, they weren't necessarily saying that if I were to kind of turn a camera onto my private life, that would be my political message. It would be more like the way and the norms that make up the household can be politicized and should be talked about publicly. Was a little bit closer to what they were talking about. So they would have consciousness raising groups where they would talk about their experiences together as women and say, okay, well, I recognize a pattern in what you're saying. There's a kind of common part of our life here, actually, in this thing that feels very much alone. When we talk about it, we see what's common, and then we can make that into part of public life, maybe try to transform it in some way. The political rights empower, on the one hand, citizens to participate in democratic legislation, which decides, among other things, on the distribution of private rights and entitlements, and thus on the citizens' opportunities to acquire an appropriate social status. On the other hand, the social status in turn creates the prerequisites and motivations for the use that public citizens actually make of their civic rights in each case. The close correlation between social status and voter turnout has been widely documented. But this expectation that democratic participation in securing social status should facilitate each other will function only as long as democratic elections actually rectify substantial and structurally entrenched social inequalities. Empirical studies confirm that vicious circle takes root when, due to resignation over the perceptible improvements in living conditions, abstentionism, not voting, becomes entrenched among lower status segments of the population. Why bother? I'm doing a lot of research on the history of non-voting in this country. I'm going to write something on it. So one of the things that's kind of fascinating is in 1920 is the election when non-voting becomes really a big issue. This is also when women get the franchise. And so people are like, why aren't all of these women voting? And some people started doing interviews and things like that. Well, some women who got the right to vote were like, I don't believe in women's right to vote. People are kind of shocked to realize that ideology doesn't work in one way. It's like it doesn't come directly out of your identity as a woman, that you wouldn't, you wouldn't have misogynistic views about women's political participation. I mean, you would be, in some sense, even more likely to have them, given that you were not given any alternative view with which to form an opinion, and you kind of had to make sense of your life. Just because people are being oppressed doesn't mean that they experience it as oppression. That's kind of a disturbing thought. But with non-voting, a lot of people who didn't vote, people had tons of different reasons for not voting, all sorts of different reasons for not voting when they first started to ask them. But what was really surprising to them was that most people that didn't vote were poor. They had imagined that, and this is fascinating to me, they had imagined, before they started doing empirical studies, that the most common non-voter would be the kind of rich guy. And that's why politics was bad, because the poor were voting too much. And then they looked into it and they're like, actually, that's not the case at all. The case is that the poor are struggling to get to the polling booths because, they have to watch the shop or somebody's sick or something like that. Okay, this draws attention finally to the precarious relationship between the democratic state and a capitalist economy that tends to reinforce social inequalities. The balancing of the conflicting functional imperatives by the welfare state is, at this level of abstraction, the third precondition for the success of a democratic regime worthy of the name. Political economy first revealed the systematic connection between the political system and society. This was the perspective from which I traced the structural transformation of the public sphere in an earlier work. However, a liberal political culture is more of a boundary condition for the state, one which happens to be satisfied to a greater or lesser extent, rather than something that depends in turn on administrative intervention. The situation is different with the social stratification of society and the existing degree of social inequality. So the public sphere feels kind of like spontaneous, it's out of the state, but how many people are working class? How many people are middle class? How many homeless people are there? How many poor people are there? Well, this is a result, not exclusively, but in some significant way, as a result of state policy. The United States has a very large homeless population. No, that's not something that we couldn't have done differently. We could have had policies like some other countries do that would directly address homelessness, and we wouldn't have as many or any homeless people. So the fact that maybe someone who's struggling to find a way to live is not like super checked into the political discourse at the time, they don't have the time to do it, affects what the public sphere looks like. All sorts of people are kind of too far out of sight. We don't really see their issues, and they don't really see these broader political issues unless they make a kind of gargantuan effort to do so, because life is really difficult. To avoid crises of social integration, governments, as Clause OFA has shown, are trying to satisfy two conflicting demands. On the one hand, they must ensure sufficient conditions for the valorization of capital in order to generate tax revenues. On the other hand, from the point of view of political and social justice, governments must satisfy the interest of the population as a whole in securing the legal and material preconditions of the private and public autonomy of every citizen. Otherwise, they will be stripped of their democratic legitimacy. However, capitalist democracies will only be able to tread a path of crisis avoidance between these two imperatives if they possess sufficient governance capacity. In other words, the scope of the interventionist policies must match the extent of the economic cycles relevant for securing national prosperity. Now here, Habermas is way more confident than I am that that there's a kind of sweet spot in between valorizing capital and doing social and political justice. To me, these seems kind of in conflict. There might not be a sweet spot, but to each their own. I'm going to move very quickly through this. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Historical account of national public spheres based on these roughly outlined systematic viewpoints would reveal how difficult it is to arrive at any tenable generalizations at all about the framework conditions for the functioning of national public spheres in different historical periods. National peculiarities overlay the general trends towards the kind of nationally organized capitalism that shaped the post-war development of democracy in the West until the neoliberal turn. So this is something I think a lot of people would disagree with, which is there's kind of a way that it all goes, but all the nations are a little bit different. I really think that's wrong, but it does involve us in even more complexity than we're already in to think about why it's wrong. But you might take a place like Indonesia, a country like Indonesia, which has had a very different history, and has a very kind of unique setup for one thing. In Indonesia is about 80% of the housing is social housing. So housing costs, which is a major political issue, not just in the United States, but all around the world. How do you afford housing right now? There's housing crises everywhere. Indonesia doesn't have as much of this, but they also have a very kind of business-friendly environment in some other areas. I'm sorry, I'm thinking about, did I say Indonesia? I meant Singapore. Oh, that's embarrassing. Indonesia also has a very interesting history in terms of you can read Marshall Salins on that. Anyway, I meant to say Singapore, but I was talking about Indonesia. Indonesia had some struggles in the 20th century politically that the U.S. was involved in, so let's not talk about that. Since the shift toward neoliberal policies, however, the Western democracies entered a phase of increasing internal destabilization, which is being aggravated by the challenges of the climate crisis and the growing pressure of immigration. A further aggravating factor is the perceived rise of China and of other emerging countries and the resulting transformation of the global economic political landscape. Okay. Even apart from the new global political situation created by the pandemic, these circumstances suggest that nation states united in the European Union must strive for greater integration. In other words, they should try to recover the competencies they have lost at the national level as a result of this development by creating new political capacities for action at the transnational level. So we have to kind of build a new world order. How dare you, Habermas, you Illuminato? However, a sober description of institutional approaches to global governance, which have consolidated rather than dismantled international asymmetries of power, does not inspire hope. So yeah, we see that we have global phenomena that are relevant. The pandemic, climate change. We need some kind of structure by which nations cooperate. The UN exists, but like any of the things that exist, the WHO, the UN, there's all sorts of problems. Some of those problems are the perceptions in many places around the world that, that this is a threat, that we have to protect ourselves from the international order. Also, there's problems within the international order because of asymmetries of power and all sorts of other things. Okay. Since that's the last bit, I will read to the end here. This would also presuppose a more pronounced opening of the national public spheres to each other, but both the divisions within the EU and the halting but ultimately accomplished Brexit suggest instead that existing democratic regimes are being hollowed out, and that the foreign policy of the great powers might even revert to a new kind of imperialism. Yeah, and again, some people would be like, new kind? Revert? We're already there. For the time being, we do not know how the national and global economic problems facing a world society stricken by a pandemic will be perceived and processed by the political elites in our countries who still have to come some power to act. At the moment, there are a few pointers for the desirable policy shift to social and ecological agenda, leading to greater integration of core Europe at least. So Habermas is very focused on Europe. He has been his whole career. He's focused on the EU as a project. He's been part of the EU as a project. But we can talk about Europe. Obviously, what's going on. He doesn't mention the Russia-Ukraine conflict here. He certainly could have. He doesn't mention it, but that is part of just a larger set of problems within the EU. There's all sorts of Eurosceptic members of the EU. So Brexit in the UK, obviously they voted to leave the European Union. That was it's an ongoing question. For instance, how to deal with the barrier between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland still hasn't been settled. So we make political deliberations now on these extremely complex things, where we make political decisions. And we haven't even had a deliberation to think through what the decision means in very practical terms about some of its major things. So Brexit is an example of that. But you have people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's really thinking in different types of turn. You have people in Eastern Europe who are not part of Europe, but because of Russia, and Belarus, you have authoritarian models that are becoming more attractive. So in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland party is the second largest party now. This is a right-wing party. And I don't mean right-wing like they're conservatives. The conservatives were in power for many, many years. That was like the most popular party for many, many years. This is the right wing. Now, they claim that they are not neo-Nazis. And I think that there probably are people, there are neo-Nazi parties, even though it's illegal in Germany. They still organize and they have street violence and things like that. But for Germany, the second largest party to be a kind of virulently anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, nationalist party is concerning, given how taboo that was in German political culture until very recently. In France, Marine Le Pen, who is the daughter of another man named Le Pen, who is a racist nationalist, kind of a party that was seen as so far to the right that it would be shameful to criticize them. She was about to win. They had to kind of create this complicated stoppage strategy of all the other parties in order to stop her from taking the French election. You can think about what's going on in the Philippines with Bongbong Marcos, and before him Duterte. Now you have like two rival versions of authoritarianism, Duterte and Marcos. Really pick any country around the world, any country, and ask how is democracy doing? And it's not going well. There's major, major issues. A Democratic Republic of the Congo right now. I mean, I don't think it's a country that has had extreme, extreme tribulations. Weirdly now, it's like having a kind of sort of popular movement because Rwanda is invading. Very, very, very disturbing things all around the world in terms of if you're hoping for democracy to win. Democracy was supposed to be the final victory. This guy, Francis Fukuyama, was like, we're at the end of history. There's nothing but liberal democracy. Where is it now? So we'll finish the rest of this in another video, but I think one of the things that makes this piece interesting to me, again, even though I disagree with a lot of what Habermas is doing, is because Habermas is one of these people that was at the center of these discussions and the realities of people who really wanted to realize a kind of vision of democracy around discursive deliberation. And huge advances were actually made. Like there really were, outside of the United States. There was a lot of questions about how to regulate something like television or the media in order to give time for public and political discourse. That still exists in some of those places. But privatization of those medias has been part of what, I have a friend who wrote a whole book about this process in Bulgaria, that the privatization of media, state media, or even kind of like private media that had some kind of public duty has gone away, has really changed the outlook of people on democracy. And even more so, perhaps, is digitalization. The digitalization, which was supposed to be the kind of most democratic thing possible. Everyone is able to publish. There's no restrictions. In the modern era, in the consolidation of the internet into a kind of small number of apps, we see a very different outlook, and democracy is on its back foot. So I hope you'll come back for the second one. I hopefully it won't be quite as long as this first one, but I hope that it's got your brain juices flowing a little bit, because the point of this stuff is to shake up your thinking, not to necessarily give you an answer to a question that you already had.